There has never been a fighting force in the history of the world more effective than the modern-day military of the United States of America. The contribution and sacrifice that our individual service members make on a daily basis is unparalleled. In order to achieve those goals, our military personnel go through a lengthy process of training and duty. When their service is complete, how well are we doing to help them reintegrate into society? How well are our soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen adapting to life in the civilian world? What happens to those unfortunate few who cannot adapt? Today we're going to be talking about veteran suicide. Let's begin with some statistics, and I hope these numbers will help convince you that the issue really is as critical as the news reports make it out to be. The United States records about 34,000 deaths from suicide per year, making this a top 10 cause of death among all Americans. 20% of those deaths are veterans. Now, you may remember that veterans make up only 10% of the total U.S. population. You might have heard numbers thrown around like somewhere between 18 to 22 veterans die by suicide on a daily basis. There are some criticisms on both sides of these numbers. Some say the data is inflated, others say the number 22 is actually too low. But it should be clear to all of us that veteran suicide is more common than civilian suicide. Women veterans are 500% or 5 times more likely to succeed in a suicide attempt than female civilians. One reason? Women veterans are more likely to use firearms in their suicide attempt than female civilians. Here's another interesting piece of information that may be extremely relevant to veteran service officers. Do you think that veterans getting care in the VA are more or less likely to end their lives by suicide than those outside the VA? Well, let's assume that that 18 veterans per day number is accurate. About 5 of those who end their lives are VA patients, and of those 5, 3 are being followed by mental health clinicians and have a mental disorder diagnosis in their records. What about those other 13 veterans? They've never stepped foot in a VA. Let me say that again. Most veterans who commit suicide are not receiving health care from the VA when they die. Now, I'm not saying they weren't receiving any attention or the attention that they needed for their mental health, but we really don't know. So here's where your role as a veteran service officer is critical. If you come across a troubled veteran who doesn't go to the VA or won't go to the VA, you can help them get connected to other resources in the community. It may not be your job to fix their mental health problem, but you can help point them in the right direction. I'm not exaggerating when I say the little bit of time you spend on this issue could be the difference between life or death. Well, one obvious truth is that every member of the United States military has expertise with firearms. The same cannot be said for civilians. In fact, veterans are more likely to use firearms to end their lives than any other means, such as drug overdoses. What diagnoses do veterans have that might be associated with suicide? Well, it's not just major depression. Other diagnoses like bipolar disorder, substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and anxiety disorders can be associated with suicide. And it's not just mental disorders. Chronic pain and sleep disorders are medical conditions that can be associated with suicide. And it may not just be mental or physical diagnoses either. Social problems like financial difficulty, relationship problems, and unemployment can be associated with suicide. Again, it's neither your role nor your expectation that you can single-handedly prevent a veteran's suicide by yourself. Instead, it's more realistic to make sure that all of us who work with veterans know what sorts of things to look out for, warning signs if you will, and also to know what to do when we see a warning sign. Let's talk a little bit about feelings, thoughts, and behaviors associated with suicide. Sometimes even mental health clinicians get feelings and thoughts mixed up. Feelings, or emotions, are pretty basic and they can be described in simple emotional language. Don't assume that the only feeling that comes before suicide is sadness. Suicide can also be accompanied by shame or anger. And let me just put this out there. Not everyone who feels sad is going to try to harm themselves. But when you see these negative feelings in your veteran, try to keep these concerns about self-harm in the back of your mind. Let's move on to thoughts. Suicidal thoughts can come impulsively, or they can come gradually with a lot of brooding and planning. One of the most common sets of thoughts to accompany suicide are called negative thoughts by mental health clinicians. Those are thoughts of helplessness, hopelessness, worthlessness, and guilt, and they can precede a suicidal act. Let's take a closer look at hopelessness. You could certainly ask a veteran if they feel hopeless, or you could get that information from conversation. Do they think their life is not going to get any better? Do they think they have nothing left to live for? Do they think that their life is not worth living anymore? You could go through a similar set of questions about helplessness, worthlessness, and guilt. There was an older belief that some people still hold that if you ask someone about suicide, it will push them into doing it. I'd like to share with you that you will not push somebody into suicide by asking them about it. You will miss information about suicide if you don't ask about it when the circumstances suggest that you should. Let's go over the progression of questions you can ask when talking to somebody about suicide. The first thing you'll want to know after you've looked into the negative thoughts is the depth of their thinking about self-harm. A natural way to go about this line of questions is to transition from questions about hopelessness to questions about suicide. And here's an example. You might say, "Do you ever feel like you have nothing left to live for?" And the veteran says yes. Then you might follow up with, "Do you ever feel like taking matters into your own hands? Do you ever feel like ending your own life?" The next question after that in this direction is to figure out if they're thinking about ways to end their lives. For many people who have these thoughts, they have not put together a plan of action, but for some, they know exactly what they're going to do. The final step in this set of questions is to look into behaviors. How much has the veteran prepared for their suicide attempt? Now, as I said, many suicide attempts are impulsive and may not have a great deal of planning involved with them. However, many other suicide attempts are carefully planned. Did the veteran start to research what materials they would need to end their lives? Did they make a list of items they might need? Did they actually gather those items? How about other preparations? Did the veteran recently update their will or write farewell letters or take out a new life insurance policy? These are all behaviors that can indicate something serious is going on. As I said earlier, the most common method for veterans to end their lives involves firearms. And as we all know, lawful gun ownership is a right in the United States. So how can we resolve this issue? If a veteran owns a firearm and has ammunition in their home, they essentially have an impulsive means to end their lives right at their fingertips. I'd suggest a few options. One option would be for the veteran to rid themselves of the firearm until they're feeling better. Even if they've not developed thoughts about using it yet, it may be better for the temptation to be removed in case those thoughts develop when no one else is around. Now, separating the veteran from their firearm does not necessarily mean they have to get rid of it completely. It may just mean they entrust it to the safekeeping of a reliable family member, a close friend, or a battle buddy. Another approach would be to make it harder for the veteran to act impulsively in their own home if they choose to keep their firearms around. Separating the ammunition from the weapon and using a gun safe are a few steps that can be added between an impulsive thought of harm and the irreversible action that might follow. So what happens when you start asking these questions and you start to get answers that worry you? Remember that you're not alone in helping this veteran. There are many types of folks that can have your back. Let's take a look at some of your options. If you have a veteran in the office with a loaded weapon, for example, and the veteran is threatening to end their lives, then of course you're going to call 911. We're going to have another module devoted to de-escalation techniques in the office that'll give you some tips and strategies to effectively work with emergency support, such as police and EMTs. What if you don't think you need to call 911, but you do think that this person needs to see someone real soon? This is where your relationship with the veteran is really tested and your knowledge of resources comes into play. Give the veteran options, even if they've already looked into things. Of course, it's easiest if the veteran is already in treatment somewhere, and it may just be a matter of calling their mental health provider from your office to make them aware the veteran's doing worse. If they're not in treatment, think about what the veteran can do next. How soon do you think they need to be seen? If you think they need to be seen real soon, give them information about crisis evaluation services. And the key part to a crisis evaluation from your perspective is following up. Get the veteran's contact information, probably their cell phone number, and tell them you're going to call them in 48 hours to make sure they had that evaluation. You can also schedule an appointment for them to come back and see you in a few days to make sure that they made it to their crisis evaluation. Finally, if you think they need an evaluation, but it's not a crisis, you can still take a similar approach, but on a longer timeline. Tell them you're going to check back with them in a few weeks or a month to make sure that they linked up with the right people. Chances are that your territory is not in the same county as a VA medical center. We have 100 counties in North Carolina and 4 VAs. You might work closer to a VA community-based outpatient clinic, but most of those are not set up for crisis evaluations. So if you call 911 or if you look for a crisis evaluation center, it's probably going to be in the civilian world. The good news is that a mental health crisis evaluation is a pretty standard procedure that can be accomplished in most emergency rooms. If things are truly concerning, it's more important to get the veteran seen in a timely manner than to wait for the perfect opportunity. We can be more choosy once the crisis has passed. So let's talk a little bit about the VA and veteran suicide prevention. Of course, every VA has some system for evaluating veterans in a mental health crisis. The difference between a VA and civilian providers is that VA providers are more accustomed to the unique needs of veterans than civilian providers are. For example, in routine primary care at the VA, every veteran is screened for depression, suicide, and PTSD. If they screen positive, they're connected with internal resources to help take care of that veteran's needs. An approach that's gaining ground in the VA is the development of a personalized suicide safety plan. A suicide safety plan is a document that starts with a blank form and is filled out by the clinician and the veteran together to include the veteran's own personal signs and strategies to combat their suicidal thoughts. It begins with warning signs that are unique to that individual and moves into coping strategies and contacts that would benefit that individual. A person you might want to meet at your local VA is the Suicide Prevention Coordinator. Suicide prevention coordinators and suicide prevention case managers work within VAs to connect and support veterans during times of their crisis. They have a role in outreach as well, to veterans and to community providers who are not part of the VA system. Every VA has a suicide prevention coordinator, and like the military sexual trauma coordinator and the OIF coordinator, these folks have time in their schedule to meet with interested parties in their area and provide information. Have you met with your VA suicide prevention coordinator? I hope you've all seen the number for the Veterans Crisis Line. That number should be everywhere. That number, of course, is 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255. This number is staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's available to veterans, their family members, or anyone else who needs to help a veteran and doesn't know where else to turn. By the way, every call that goes through the National Veterans Crisis Line is referred the following day to the local suicide prevention coordinator at the closest VA. If you have a veteran who's technologically savvy, then consider the Virtual Hope Box app available on Apple and Android devices. It's free, and it's a great addition to the in-person care that a veteran may receive from a live clinician. Of course, no smartphone application replaces actual health care, and I'm not advocating that we tell anyone to use the Virtual Hope Box instead of seeking treatment. Suicide among veterans is a serious issue, and I hope that you have a better idea about how to start asking about it and what to do when you hear something concerning, and finally, where to find resources. Your job is to keep your eyes and ears open, try to instill hope, and connect those who served with the resources that are waiting for them.